Now that the visual interface is created, we can start working with the plumbing behind the scenes and get our application to work and respond to events that are created by the user. In C#, there is a special relationship to the XAML file and the C# code that drives it. The most basic definition is that they are two sides of the same coin. The XAML file represents the layout and the objects that are in your application. It defines what is there, how it looks, and how it's arranged. However, the XAML file doesn't determine what the application does. C# is the language that we will use to define what happens on the other side of the coin, what happens when the user works with the application. Now, for our tip calculator application, the actions will be pretty basic. We want to take the amount that the user entered, multiply it by the tip percentage, display the tip amount, and then add that to the original total to get the final total, including the tip. This is the logic of the application, and we will build this using C#. Windows Phone 8 supports multiple languages for your app development. We are using C# in this case, but you can also use Visual Basic or C++ if you are familiar with those languages. I should also point out it is possible to build your application entirely with C# and not use XAML. This is because every object you are creating in XAML is actually a C# class or object that is represented as XAML tags. Object or class properties are exposed as tag attributes. While this is possible, I wouldn't recommend this at first because it can get confusing. But you will come across times when you need to create visual components as the app runs and process the application logic. It is possible to do this since all the components are C# classes. Now, when you create a new project, the mainpage.xaml file is created for you. Along with that is the mainpage.xaml.cs file. The CS extension stands for C#. This is called the code behind file. Again, think of this as the back side of the coin, defining more of what the application does. In fact, in the Solution Explorer, it is collapsed within the XAML file. Now let's work with the project we finished in the last video to see the code behind file. If you're continuing from the previous video, you can work with the file you already have open. If not, go ahead and open the Start project for this video from the downloaded exercise files. With the XAML file open, you might ask, where is the code behind file? You already are looking at code. Well, if you go to the Solution Explorer, twirl the disclosure triangle for the XAML file. There is the XAML.cs file, which is the code behind file for this XAML document. Double-click it to open the file in Visual Studio. You'll notice that the Visual Studio layout changes when you open this. Now that we are working with application logic, there is no design view. That is because we are no longer working with the XAML design layer of our application. We are now working with the logic. So let's go ahead and step through a bit of what's going on here. So at the top, from lines 1 through 10, are a number of using statements. These statements are referencing other classes and objects outside of our project to be bundled and accessible from this code file. On line 12, we start the code for the file by defining a namespace, in this case, the name of our app, and then create a constructor on lines 16 through 23. Now, if you aren't familiar with object-oriented programming, the constructor is essentially what is run first when the file runs. It constructs the project and gets everything set up. You'll see a lot of code here is colored differently than the rest of the code. These lines are commented out, meaning that they have been converted to non-executable code. These lines, if you remove the double slashes in front of them, will add an application bar to your project. Our project doesn't need an app bar, and we can remove them safely without harming anything. Let's go ahead and do that to make the code a little bit easier to read. So I'm going to select lines from 25 to 39, and then just going to press delete. We can also select line 21 through 22 and delete those as well. When we start adding our code to this, we're going to do a few things. First, we are going to define in our code behind file any variables we're going to work with in our project. Next, we will create an event trigger in our XAML file that will listen for when an event takes place with a component and then execute a named function of code in this code behind file. For example, if the 15% button is pressed, we want to calculate the tip. The XAML code will listen for the user to do something, and when it does, execute a piece of code in the code behind file. We could get all tricky and ultra streamlined with the code, but we're going to keep it simple. We'll have some repetition, but it'll help reinforce some of the concepts you'll find when working on your own with Windows Phone 8. So with our basic overview of how the code behind file relates to your project, let's go back to the XAML file and start creating some triggers.